We can no longer delay the urgent call to redress the historical injustice to Africa and address our call for equitable and balanced representation on the Security Council.
What does it mean when a continent of 1.4 billion people, a continent that carries the weight of peacekeeping, minerals, climate battles, and demographic dynamism, still has no permanent voice at the world's most powerful table? Tonight, Namibia's President Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah steps to the UN podium with three sharp truths. Africa must be represented, sovereignty must be respected, and women must be leading. And her message is not a whisper, it is a drumbeat. It asks the UN a simple, uncomfortable question. How can you be united if Africa remains on the margins? Together, we rise. Let's go inside the speech. 3 pillars, 1 message. Power with fairness. You see it, you feel it. History doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in the steady voice of a leader who has waited a lifetime to say, include Africa. Respect sovereignty. Lift women. Namibia's president, Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, her very presence carries a story. The first woman to lead her nation, sworn in on March 21, 2025, the 35th anniversary of Namibia's independence. That alone is a headline, but it's also a credential for this moment. If a nation can break its own ceilings, so can the world's institutions. Africa doesn't come to the UN to ask for favors. Africa comes to ask for fairness. And fairness has a form, a permanent African voice on the UN Security Council, the end to unilateral sanctions that punish ordinary people, and women seated at the front of decision-making tables, not in the back rows. Let's talk about power. The Security Council decides on war and peace. It authorizes sanctions, mandates peace operations, and at its best, prevents catastrophes. Yet Africa, 54 nations, has no permanent seat. How do you square that circle? You don't. It's a contradiction that corrodes the UN's legitimacy. And legitimacy is not a luxury. It's the glue that holds multilateralism together. President Nandi-Ndaitwah is not improvising. She is echoing Africa's common position, the Azulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration, which calls for no fewer than 2 permanent African seats with veto and additional non-permanent seats. It's not a new plea, it's a standing claim. The argument is simple. Africa is constantly on the Council's agenda. Africa must be permanently in the Council's decisions. Nothing about us without us isn't a slogan. It's a structural correction. Let that land. Because when a continent that supplies troops, hosts missions, and pays the cost of instability is denied a permanent vote, you don't have a United Nations. You have an imbalanced one. Her point is clear. Reform is not a favor to Africa. It's survival for the UN. Either the Council's architecture catches up to the 21st century, or its authority keeps bleeding out. You see, if the G20 can recognize the African Union's seat to reflect economic reality, why can't the Security Council reflect political reality with permanent African representation? When one body evolves and the other stays frozen, the world notices. Here's the heartbeat: sovereignty. The UN Charter is not a menu, it's a covenant.
Madam President, the Charter of the United Nations has laid the foundation for conditions necessary for peaceful coexistence and harmony among nations. Therefore, unilateral cohesive measures should not be used as a tool to undermine sovereign state, for this violates the Charter and the principle of the United Nations. In this regard, we call for an end to the continued illegal economic, financial, and commercial embargo imposed on the friendly people of Cuba and removing her from the list state sponsoring terrorism. We call for an end to the illegal sanction on Zimbabwe. We are also gravely concerned about the emerging threats against Venezuela and call for the removal of sanctions and the threats against that country.
When powerful states reach for unilateral sanctions and extraterritorial embargoes, who pays the price? not elites who can move money. It's ordinary people who face medicine shortages, collapsed supply chains, and blocked access to global markets. President Nandi Ndaitwah called it out. She raised nations like Cuba, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, countries where unilateral measures have carried real human consequences. She is saying, if we believe in international law, then stop using tools that undermine it. Engage multilaterally, not unilaterally. Let's be honest. Sanctions are often presented as precision tools. In practice, they can behave like sledgehammers, hitting hospitals, food systems, and family remittances. In Cuba, decades of embargo have produced shortages that every family understands too well. In Zimbabwe, measures intersect with economic fragilities to shrink opportunity. In Venezuela, oil sanctions rippled across an entire economy. She's not romanticizing governments, she's defending people's right to breathe, to trade, to access finance, to live without collective punishment. That is the sovereignty she's speaking about. Now hear this. If the UN is serious about preventing conflict and building peace, why deploy tools that deoxygenate economies and drive social stress? Why not return to the Charter's core? Dialogue, mediation, consent, and collective action, not unilateral coercion? This is where the speech becomes personal and political at once.
Madam President, 30 years since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action, we have made much to celebrate and to ponder on. Namibia continues to make progress in the area of women participation in politics and decision-making. Currently, Namibia's cabinet has 57% of women. As we gear up to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, adopted during Namibia's presidency of the UN Security Council, Namibia will host two high-level events in Windhoek and New York. I look forward to the participation of all member states in those events to collectively reaffirm commitment to women, peace and security agenda. And through the Namibia International Women Peace Center, we will continue to advocate for the universal implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
President Nandi Ndaitwah is not speaking about women from a distance. She is the evidence. A freedom fighter turned foreign minister turned head of state, now advocating for women to be at the peace table, on the ballot, and in the cabinet. Not as a box-tick exercise, but because peace lasts longer and policies work better when half the population is fully represented. From the Women, Peace and Security agenda to the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action, she connects the dots. Where women lead, communities stabilize. Where women participate, compromises stick. And she made that case on the UN's own stage during high-level events on women's rights this week. Namibia's moment is powerful symbolism. First female president, a system opening doors. But the call is global. Measure parliaments, cabinets, mediation teams by outcomes, not optics. If the goal is durable peace and inclusive growth, then women aren't a quota, they're the engine. What would the Security Council look like if Africa's permanent voice included women negotiators and women defense experts at the core? Would mandates change? Would ceasefires hold faster? Would sanctions, if ever used multilaterally, be designed with human impact assessments led by women economists and social scientists? The president's speech is not three separate demands, it's one triangle. Representation without sovereignty is a nice speech that ends when the cameras switch off. Sovereignty without women's leadership reproduces old patterns with new faces. Women's leadership without institutional reform hits a ceiling. But all three together, a permanent African voice at the Security Council, a recommitment to the UN Charter without unilateral punishments, and women leading with authority, that is system change. And it's not theoretical. We can see the pathway. If Africa gets 2 permanent seats with veto, as Ezulwini demands, suddenly the calculus of intervention changes. If unilateral sanctions give way to charter-based collective measures, we stop punishing civilians and start solving problems. If women are at every table, we close the gap between policy and people. That's the architecture this speech points toward. But skeptics will say, nice ideas, but who will give up power? The answer is history. Power rarely moves until it must. But legitimacy has a way of forcing must. We've already seen movement. The African Union admitted to the G20. Because the global economy doesn't function without Africa's growth story and resources. Political architecture tends to follow economic reality. The president's line is pushing that domino toward the Security Council. On sovereignty and sanctions, momentum is also shifting. Every year, UN votes pile up against blanket embargoes. Civil society, economists, and even former officials increasingly warn that broad unilateral measures backfire, entrench black markets, and corrode trust. The call is for lawful, targeted, collectively decided responses, not unilateral punishment that becomes a way of life. That was the moral core of her second pillar. And on women's leadership, look at the map. From Windhoek to Dodoma, from Kigali to Monrovia across time, the evidence mounts. When women hold executive authority and critical portfolios, service delivery improves, corruption declines, social investment rises. Namibia's own political milestones this year, together with the president's presence at UN high-level forums on women's rights, send a clear message. It's not charity, it's good governance. If legitimacy is the cheapest currency in diplomacy and women's leadership is the highest ROI in governance, why are we still delaying the obvious reforms? So what now? Here's the three-step test the president's speech quietly sets for all of us. 1. Can we keep Africa's common position, Ezulwini, front and center, united across regions and parties? Because unity is leverage, fragmentation is surrender. 2. Can we press for charter-based solutions in every crisis? That means pushing back on unilateral sanctions, insisting on dialogue, and using multilateral tools designed to protect people, not score points. 3. Can we insist that every delegation, mission, and negotiation team includes women in numbers that matter and roles that decide? Because if you can't see women in the frame, you won't find them in the outcome. Do this, and Africa moves from subject to shaper of the global order. Let me ask you directly, and I want you to answer in the comments. 1. Should Africa have 2 permanent seats with veto on the UN Security Council? Yes or yes? If yes, what's the smartest path to get there? 2. Do unilateral sanctions help or harm ordinary people? What would a charter-faithful alternative look like in practice? And 3. What's one concrete move your country can take tomorrow to put more women into decision-making roles, in parliament, cabinets, and peace talks? And we say, if you believe Africa must rise, comment, Africa must rise. If you believe in the charter type, respect sovereignty. If you believe women must lead, say it. Women lead, nations rise. There's an African proverb you know well. Until the lion tells the story, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Tonight, the lion spoke. In her steady voice, President Nandi Ndaitwah told the UN 3 truths: recognize Africa, respect the charter, raise women. None of these are radical. All of these are reasonable. And together they are revolutionary, because they move power from rhetoric to representation, from politics to people, from promises to practice. When future generations study this era, they won't just ask what speeches were given. They'll ask what changed. Seats, sanctions policy, women in charge. That's how you measure history. That's how you measure us. Truth is verified and Africa writes its own future. Whether you're in Namibia, Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, or in the diaspora, you are part of this movement. If you believe in an Africa rising with dignity and self-reliance, stand with us.